So what I'd like to do with this talk, and I think I tried to do it last time, but is I want to get quickly to the heart of the matter, to the flow recommendations, the discussion, the rationale, what we wrestled with. I'd like to stay away from lengthy discussions of technical details about study methods. Now that being said, if anyone is interested in discussions of technical nerdy details, hit me up, we could talk all night. But I think that would be less fascinating and less useful for sure for you guys, rather than to get to the big picture components of the study. So this study focused on the Shasta Canyon, what we're calling the Shasta Canyon, which is really the lower 8 miles of the river to the Klamath. Top of your screen there, and there's White Creek coming in, and we're all sitting right below, right below that screen. It's a unique stretch of the river, the Shasta. It's the, we like to call it the gatekeeper. I mean, every adult salmon swimming up the Klamath wants to end up in the Shasta, comes through the canyon. And every juvenile born and raised and reared comes out of the gravel, wherever it is up in the upper river, they're going to come through the canyon. So the conditions in the canyon play a big role in the salmon population of the Shasta River. It's an important place for that purpose. Here's the kind of the immediate watershed of the canyon. And as I said, I want to get to the heart of the matter. So I'm just going to provide some brief context for the study, briefly some of the history of where this started from. We'll go over that real quick. Define the objective, the question we answered. That's a good place to talk about what this study is and perhaps what it isn't. Go through the hydrographs, the existing hydrographs that we have there today, and what we estimated was the unimpaired hydrographs. Talk about our flow recommendations. Talk about what drove those recommendations, where we have more or less certainty in them, and perhaps what could come next in this work. So the study context, coho in this part of the world, the Sonk ESU, Southern Oregon, Northern California, evolutionary significant unit, were listed as threatened in 1997 under the Federal Endangered Species Act, and the State Endangered Species Act. Listing of coho was 2005. In the Shasta area, Department of Fish and Wildlife started being concerned and looking into Instream flows in 2006. And there was I'm sure you all remember, the basin-wide permitting program that did not ever really realize its goals, I think. And we got involved right after that time developing some study methods for how would you go about quantifying in-stream flows in this river, in-stream flow needs. And during that time, we had some real low returns of Chinook and coho, specifically 2010. We were asked to look at two parts of the river. One was the Big Springs area below Lake Shastina, and the other was this reach down here in the Shasta Canyon. Those flow studies were a little different. The Big Springs flow study was initially triggered, by this work in 2006, and it was supposed to be quick, interim, just give us some numbers to kind of know where we're going. As the permitting program fell apart, that transitioned to more and more defensible flow recs. We were asked to, so we kind of had a little stretching and growing process in that project. The canyon study was always supposed to be a comprehensive flow study, final set of flow recommendations. And I'll talk about how we differentiated those two a little bit. And it's worth saying that this process has been through quite a bit of peer review. It may go through quite a bit more peer review in the future, both from a technical review team and from the department itself, and internally in our office. We beat ourselves up pretty good over these things before they go out the door. So I don't think it's possible to get out of an in-stream flow study without a couple of black eyes. So to get to the objective, the question that this study asks is to estimate the duration, magnitude, frequency, and timing of flows that would sustain populations, salmon populations, and supporting organisms in the Shasta, and specifically to the Shasta River Canyon. That's a big question. It's a broad question, and it has there are a multitude of implications to what a stream flow a stream flow that would do that requires. And you have to consider that over more than one water year type. You know, you can't, it's easy to say, well, this is the number, you know, X number is going to make it work, and yet that's not how the system worked. Naturally, it's not how most rivers work. Fish deal with variable flows all the time. So this is the dichotomy and the difficulty of an in-stream flow study is you have to ask the river, well, how much water do you need to meet the life history needs of fish? And you have to find a way for it to tell you. Yeah.
Hey, Gabe, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
When you say sustain the population,
Yeah.
are you talking about a particular life stage in the canyon, or are you guys
No,
contemplating an entire life cycle?
we are contemplating it. We are contemplating the entire life cycle. Whether or not each part of that life cycle is completed in the canyon is not addressed and we will get to that. I think I know where you're going with that question, but we definitely look at all phases of the life cycle, but we don't necessarily assume that they complete that entire life cycle within the canyon. I think that will be more clear as we get to the discussion. Because, yeah, let's see. What's not on here, I guess it's worth saying, what's not on here is anything else associated with water use, right? This is a salmon-centric flow study. This is a flow study that was focused entirely on saying what is going to sustain salmon populations. It was not a flow study that's going to say how are we going to balance needs for fisheries with needs for ag or needs for other beneficial uses in the basin. Specifically, and I'm not a lawyer. You can tell by the beard. The state water, the State Water Resources Control Board. Their job is to balance public trust interests with private property rights, with water allocations, etc. To make that decision, to make that balancing act, they need information about in-stream flow requirements. And so they're going to take this information. If the department so chooses to submit it to them, they'll take this information and they will make that determination with respect to water rights allocation, permitting, and all those things. So this study doesn't address any of that. That work needs to be done. And I think, personally, I feel like there needs to be some work to support that determination. But we are here now talking about in-stream flow needs to be fish. And I just think it's worth saying that that was the sole focus of this work.
A quick question, and
Yeah.
this kind of goes back a few slides, but they've basically identified the coho being
Threatened.
threatened
Yeah.
in '97.
Yeah.
Okay, decade or 2 decades before that,
Mhm.
was that an issue, or is there data or history that says the populations were acceptable or were normal?
So definitely coho populations throughout California have been in decline for a long time. The earliest records of cohos, we have some issues, we have some problems because back in the teens and pre-teens, a lot of folks didn't differentiate, and Bill can probably speak to this better than I can, but a lot of folks didn't differentiate coho and chinook. They were just all salmon. Some people call them salmon trout, you know, so it's like sometimes folks didn't know what species they were specifically looking at. But from the 30s on, we really started to pay closer attention to species distribution and abundance, specifically in California, and especially farther south. Coho have been pretty dramatically in decline. And when they were listed in '97, there had already been alarm bells going off for a long time for that. Is that about the way you put it, Bill?
Yeah.
And I want to say we addressed the in-stream flow needs over 2 water year types, and I'll talk about why we picked 2 water year types. But what we call a normal wet year and what we call a dry year, based on the likelihood that amount of precipitation would happen. So anytime you do an in-stream flow study, you want to have an idea of what the available water supply is, what the unimpaired flow would have been in that system. That was a trick in the Shasta. The Shasta is hydrologically rich, and that's a really good thing for its ecosystem. I think that's a good thing for folks that live here too. It makes it hard to untangle the web of where all the water comes from. In fisheries work and hydrology work, we often talk about rainfall-driven systems, or snowmelt-driven systems, or spring flow-driven systems, meaning those are the driving components that make that ecosystem function. The Shasta has all that. It has clearly a spring flow component. You can see in our unimpaired estimates, flow never really dropped below 130 CFS at all. You can see the rainfall spikes, especially in the winter period. And then you can see, if you overlay, I don't have it on here, but you can see this period here, starting in kind of early April and moving into June, July, where we have this recession. This is snowmelt. That's a snowmelt signature that exists in this basin. And to actually compute this, we had to use the available data we had, and we had water record data from the water masters on the Edgewood gauge between 1960 and 1967. That's the only period we're able to really, until now, get a good idea of unimpaired estimates. And we can do that again now, and I think it is worth, and Adrian brought this up, it really would be a valuable exercise to get an estimate of what water supply is now, to see if we are seeing climatic and climate-driven changes to this unimpaired baseline, because that will have implications on how we consider managing for fish as well as all beneficial uses. So between 1990 and 2010, here are the hydrographs, as compared to the unimpaired baseline. So you can take a look at the years set up the same way. And obviously you see the signature. You notice that actually, specifically, it's worth seeing here, this January, February, March period, it's lower, but it's not, there's not a huge disparity. I had these two hydrographs up, my wife's a school teacher, and I had these up and I was staring at them and doing some work in the office, and one of the kids came up and, they have this game, find the different, what's different in this picture and that picture, and they love that game. And they look at the two hydrographs and everybody points at April 1st, a bunch of fifth graders. And, I think that that's clearly the biggest difference here between the two flow regimes, historic or the unimpaired flow regime and the existing flow regime. So to start my talk at the end, basically, here are the results of our flow study. The black line on the top here shows our estimate for in-stream flow needs during a normal wet water year, 60% exceedance. The red line shows our estimates of in-stream flow needs during a dry water year type. And you can see that compared to the existing, and this is the signature here. This, you can kind of see this, I don't know why it's coming in a hex kind of shape, but that is the unimpaired baseline estimate up above compared to the existing impaired flows. And you can see that for some parts of the water year, our flow recommendations are about equal to or lower than what's in the river now. For other parts of the water year, they're significantly higher. And we'll talk about that, where that information came from. Do we have any questions so far? Is everybody? Yeah.
What's the current flow right now? Do you have any idea?
Today, right now, I can look it up on my phone, but I don't.
I'll look it
Yeah.
It
was 55 yesterday.
Yeah. It was been about. Yeah. It was about
They're
there.
bouncing between the low 20s to the mid 50s.
What today is April 29th? Yeah. So we'd be right about here. Okay. So here's our same set of flow recommendations, the wet normal versus the dry year. And here's the unimpaired hydrograph. And I think it's worth talking about the differences between the base flows on the unimpaired hydrograph, the lowest, driest years, and the recommended flows. Again, this work needs to be done. This is not, I have not done this work in terms of quantifying available flow for diversion. But all the water under that curve in that shaded area is stream flow greater than what we are computing as the in-stream flow needs for fish. And theoretically would be available for appropriate use. And I don't know what the acre foot volume of that is. And again, I think before we would compute that, it'd be good to know what our estimate of unimpaired is for today. So you asked about the life cycle and where these flow rates come from. I think one of the important things to do when you're developing an in-stream flow study, given the magnitude of the questions you can ask, is to have a story. It's kind of like a choose your own adventure story. You know, you start at some point and you say, do I have the requirements to move on to the next point? And you know, the story, we can start, it's easy to start with the adults migrating in. You know, the adult fish migrating in, they're coming in from the Klamath, they've got triggers that are stimulating them to move upstream. They need hydraulic conditions that are going to be suitable for them to migrate over riffles, to pass through and to get to desirable spawning locations. When they get to those desirable spawning locations, they need hydraulic conditions that are going to allow them to spawn, to produce a red, to build a red, and not just in one location in the channel. If you were doing a minimum in-stream flow study, looking at what's the baseline, what's the lowest flow that we could get by, you would say, well, let's make sure there's enough water so that right here in the middle of the channel, fish can build a red. And that work is done, and there is a place for minimum in-stream flow studies. That's not what this project was. But what we tried to do was provide spawning over a range of spawning environments, to have spawning in the channel, to have spawning expand to the margins, sometimes spawning inside channels when it's appropriate, and to make sure that the hydraulic conditions were available for that spawning to occur. One of the advantages of spreading your reds out in your channel evolutionarily is that when you go through periods of low flow or periods of high flow can scour the reds that are near the channel. Periods of low flow can desiccate and dry up the reds that are on the margins. And so that's a life history strategy that you'll see fish doing when they're spawning on a hydrograph. When the flow is higher, they'll produce their reds and start to distribute them laterally across the channel. So we continue our story. We've got reds built, little eggs in the gravel, and the alevin are emerging. They got their yolk sac attached. They're digesting that yolk sac, and they need to they're very sensitive to both hydraulic, to water temperature, to water chemistry at that point in their life. As they grow and get a little bigger, they're starting to look for food, you know, and especially the small juveniles, they'll eat algae at that phase. But they're looking for drifting organics and benthic invertebrates, and as well as other invertebrates, terrestrials and stuff that fall in as they grow larger and become more territorial. And the needs for juvenile fish as they start to change their body type and smolt when they're ready to head to the ocean the next year or in 2 years, depending on their life cycle, sometimes 3 years. There's all types of variability out there. Then growth becomes really, really critical. One of the things we know about steelhead, a lot of literature on this, is that the likelihood of a steelhead returning as an adult, of a juvenile out-migrating returning as an adult, is very much a function of size and length. If you take a pen, I like to do this, it's just because it's simple, but a pen almost always about 130 millimeters. I've measured a lot of pens just for this reason. It's like a standard pen length. 130 millimeter smolt, steelhead smolt, if it goes into the ocean, based on the best literature we have, in California, has about a 1 to 3% chance, a 1 to 3 in 1,000 chance, that's 0.1 to 0.3% chance of returning as an adult. If you can add the cap length of the pen, say that much, I don't have a cap on this pen, it's much better when you have a cap on the pen for this little analogy. If you can have the cap length of the pen, you get 175 millimeter smolt, it's got a 20 in 1,000 chance. You just quintupled, or more than quintupled, its likelihood of returning as an adult. That's a function of the ability for those fish to feed, to run into bioenergetic conditions that are favorable. So the combination of food supply, water temperature, and the energy expenditure that they have to put out to head down to the ocean. When flow velocity is high enough, fish will orient themselves facing upstream to take advantage of drift. So in an ideal setting, a juvenile smolt, will never swim to the ocean. It'll go backwards for all 70 miles down the Klamath River, except for maybe through some slow patches, you know. It'll get pushed all the way out to the ocean. And in that case, it can feed and take advantage of the hydraulics and hydraulic setting that are going to produce big, healthy fish. You might not be able to see the otter swimming behind it. But, you know, that's why you lay 5,000 eggs. And for the fish that don't out-migrate that year, you've got juveniles that have to oversummer. Oversummering in California is often the bottleneck. You know, in our Mediterranean type streams where we have a spring recession down to a very low summer base flow, especially when you're in the upper watershed, there's only enough room for a certain number of large juvenile fish. You know, you can pile in a whole bunch of fry, but you start to become space limited. The Shasta is a little bigger system, and it has the benefit of really prodigious and unique spring systems that allow for some more capacity for those fish, and also provide summer temperatures, which really limit bioenergetic growth and productivity in other systems, allow for those cooler summer temperatures to support really good summer growth. So it's unique in that way. So that type of story is what is the basis for our in-stream flow study, and in each phase we have to evaluate using standard methods that we can explain to other folks what the in-stream flow requirements are to allow that life history phase to occur. Oops. Yeah. So here in the canyon, we picked study sites to evaluate those life history phases. We walked the canyon the whole way up, and we worked with, made sure we had access to local landowners. One of the major issues was getting access, getting a hold of folks, and we were able to put in 4 modeling sites, 4 sites that we could look at really intensively. And we also set up 14 photo monitoring stations where we took a series of panoramic photos over a range of flows. It's really amazing. A picture really is worth 1,000 words, and if you have them set at the exact same location, the same angle, and you take that same picture at multiple flows, the things that pop out that are really useful, it really lend a lot of value to the study. So we had the otolith run site, and there's also a productivity site where we looked at benthic invertebrate growth in a riffle. The Hudson 2D modeling site, Salmon Heaven 2D modeling site, and we also had a side channel in the Salmon Heaven 2D modeling site that we looked at. I'll talk about the 2D modeling a little bit, but not a lot. We had a site originally at La Viola, and we came back and all of our gear was pulled out, and we had to abandon that site. And then we initially tried to set up a modeling site up here below the powerhouse, and the hydraulics were too complex to be able to model that site. So this study, a lot of in-stream flow studies focus on one method for evaluating the relationship between stream flow and habitat, stream flow and productivity. And we took advantage of some work that was done earlier in the basin to kind of set us up to use a whole lot of different methods. We have one-dimensional and two-dimensional models that are both involved in this. We have mesohabitat analysis that just looks at areas of the river that provide conditions for fish to be successful. We did direct habitat mapping, where we were actually out in the channel, mapping areas of space, mapping polygons that provide good conditions for fish. All the 1D, 2D modeling, direct habitat mapping information went into habitat rating curves. So the habitat rating curves are really useful in an in-stream flow study. What they tell you is, as stream flow increases, how does the amount of space, the habitat, change for a specific life history function, whether it's spawning, whether it's juvenile rearing, whatever we're focusing at. Obviously, I talked about the photo documentation, and then we did a regression-based evaluation of water temperature. Water temperature is one of the major driving and limiting factors for fish, and we wanted to do a water temperature model. It wasn't able to be done in this study, and I'm going to talk about that in terms of some uncertainty associated with the regression. But the regression gave us an idea of when we reached a certain flow, how likely were we to be within some temperature threshold that promoted successful fish. Okay, that's a lot of overview. There's something I was going to say right back here. When you use a habitat assessment, whether it's a two-dimensional model or a one-dimensional model, and you get a rating curve, you get a whole bunch of information about a life history phase you're looking at. But how do you quantify a flow? How do you say, well, the number is 7, the number is 12? And they can seem arbitrary at times. There are some really good qualitative guidelines that have been developed for that. And I think Peter Moyle is an excellent fisheries biologist out of Davis. He developed a set of guidelines specifically for this when you're talking about what's a flow that's going to support a population for a different life stage that you're looking at. Population modeling, population dynamics are very complex. There's lots of biological interactions that go on. So how can you say that this flow is going to meet all those life history needs to produce a sustainable population? The short answer is you can't. An in-stream flow study without a population model isn't going to quantify and consider some of those complex biological interactions. Rather, he provides 2 guidelines that say if these 2 things are met, if you qualitatively meet these 2 guidelines, then you can say that your flow is not inhibiting population success, and therefore the flow regime that you're promoting with this analysis, separate from potentially invasive species and other biological metrics that we are quantifying, is going to support a population. Those 2 guidelines are, one, that extensive habitats available for all life history phases, all life history tactics, I'm sorry. And let me talk about a life history tactic. I'm using probably a lot of jargon here. Life history tactic is just simply a pathway through time and space. So if I'm a little smolt or if I'm a little juvenile fish, and I decide I'm going to wait until April, and then on April I'm up at Big Springs, and on April I'm going to move down to the canyon, but I'm going to like it in the canyon. I'm going to stay in the canyon until July, and then I'm going to head out to the Klamath. That's one life history tactic. Another life history tactic might be, I like it up here at Big Springs. I don't want to go down to the canyon this year. I'm going to rear for a whole other summer and get big and fat before I decide to head out to the ocean. That's a separate life history tactic. So you want to consider in your habitat assessment that you're providing for at least the most likely life history tactics that are going to drive a population, which means, of course, that you need to consider what those life history tactics are before you do your evaluation. The second of Moyle's 2 criteria are that all life history stages and the required habitats are sufficiently broadly distributed to sustain the species indefinitely. That's a tough one, right? Especially when we're focusing on just the Shasta Canyon. So the way we applied that in the Shasta Canyon was we said, okay, we're going to look at a range of spawning locations in the canyon. We're going to look at a range of juvenile rearing locations in the canyon. And we're going to make sure that in a wet year, it's not just the spawning locations that provide spawning at the lowest flow that we're going to use as a criteria for meeting this, but rather, are we providing spawning throughout the canyon in an extensive range of reaches that will work during wetter or drier years? For example, in wetter years, you might want to have spawning up in the side channel. We found a lot of fish spawning in side channels that may not be available for spawning in a drier year, but is a really valuable strategy in a wet year because those fish are going to emerge into an environment that's probably more thermally, the water temperatures are going to be more inclined in that environment for those fish to be successful in the future. Distributing your reds, like I said, is an important evolutionary strategy for fish, and so just as an example from the spawning perspective, that's how we would use the qualitative criteria from Moyle to say whether or not we feel like these in-stream flow recommendations are going to support a population.
Didn't Moyle also say, though, that that stretch of the canyon was an ecological trap because of the altered channels and mining and altered flows? And
Yeah,
so is it really the goal? Is that a recommendation, this report, to create all life cycles in those ecological traps?
Moyle did talk about the ecological trap, and specifically he was talking about that if coho spawned extensively in the canyon, that the juvenile coho emerging from those reds, we're going to face some pretty warm water temperatures and maybe not be successful.
I thought there was also because of disconnects in the stream with different bed heights and how they had been mined. No, just water temperature was another thing.
I have to go back and read his whole paper. I think the canyon does have, there are some places where there's a little bit of perching, but That's not gonna limit juvenile rearing, I think, throughout most of the canyon. And stranding is a function of stream flow in the canyon more than it is a function of more fall, in my opinion. But we were not, there is a trap, or there is a difficulty in promoting spawning in the canyon, which is that steelhead, chinook, and coho are all gonna spawn in about the same type of environment. There's differences, obviously, different hydraulic requirements a little bit, but a real good pool tail that's gonna attract chinook is very likely gonna attract steelhead and coho as well. And so, you run into a situation where if you don't provide that spawning for fish that like the chinook are gonna be migrating out before the summer, primarily, most of them will. And the canyon then is a very valuable spawning location for chinook. Well, if you don't provide that opportunity for chinook, then you're impairing their population. And yet, if you do provide it, you may encourage some coho to spawn in the canyon where it wouldn't be ideal. The way we address that is we made sure that the in-stream flows were sufficient to provide spawning for chinook, but we also made sure that passage was met and that fish that were stimulated to migrate upstream to the better spawning locations would be able to.
So you had to drive the baseline up higher to compensate for those traps.
Yeah, I think I don't think we changed the flow requirement didn't change because of that, and the passage was going to be needed for spawning anyway. Our stream flows that meet passage for chinook, coho, and steelhead are all pretty much lower than the stream flows that meet spawning requirements, and so that passage is met. Once you have flows that are meeting spawning requirements, your passage requirements are met in the canyon.
Did you take into consideration the gravel that was added down by Hudson in the river? That it was done a long time ago, probably in the 80s. And they put barriers kind of across the river in several spots.
Are you talking about the weirs that are down there? Is that?
I
No,
think that's what she's talking about.
Oh, no.
well, it wasn't really weird. They put,
Gabion baskets, I think. There's rock weirs to hold the gravel that's been placed for spawning.
yeah,
I think
but
Big rock.
yeah, big rocks, yeah.
No, we evaluated spawning polygons, we mapped their spatial extent, and then we modeled which flows would provide good spawning habitat just based on what was there in the canyon. The flow study doesn't take into account geomorphic requirements about, okay, what type of high flow regimes are gonna bring new fresh spawning gravels in. And that is one limitation. It's not a full ecosystem flow study that considers complex flow regimes that promote geomorphic movement as well as riparian stuff. It's salmon centric. And so we considered the spawning habitat that we found when we were that's what we evaluated. So to talk about water year variability a little bit, most in-stream flow studies in California will recommend a different set of in-stream flows over a range of water year types. This is especially important in Mediterranean climates when your duration for good habitat conditions may be way different in a wet year than they are in a dry year. The Shasta River is not typical of most California streams in that those base flows really drove a pretty stable environment. There absolutely was variability between years, and I think we all learned a lesson with this year. This dry, how amazingly dry it is this year, and the snow melt is reduced. But the variability is considerably less than when you look at other streams. So often you'll find probabilities of water years happening, and they'll be classified as extremely wet, normal, dry, extremely dry. We felt like, given the modest variability, and it's really driven by differences in rainfall and snow melt, that 2 water year types were appropriate for the Shasta. Now, this is our take on it. The state board may say, no, we'd like to see 4, or we don't think there should be any, or, this is the way we assumed it would work. This has been done, there's, Natural Marine Fishery Service has used this exact same criteria for changing water years. In Alameda Creek, they've used it. There's a couple other references where this has been done. And so we chose a 60% exceedance, meaning 60%, your 60% wettest years, those are going to be considered normal wet years, and the 40% years, which are your driest years, will be considered dry years. And we computed different in-stream flow needs during wet and dry years. And I'll talk a little bit how we did that. Let me talk about that actually right now. In the canyon, especially for juvenile rearing habitat, one of the dichotomies you work with, I'm using that word dichotomy, I'm not sure it's the right word. One of the trade-offs you work with in in-stream flow assessment is this idea of space and productivity. A lot of in-stream flow studies will bank on habitat area, right? They'll say, okay, over a range of flows, what flows provide the most habitat area? And they'll assume that if you're providing a lot of habitat area, obviously that's good for population success and population recovery. But habitat area and productivity and food are not necessarily the same thing. And flows that provide a lot of space may not provide a lot of food. I liken this to a developer who gets a real good deal on land in the Mojave Desert and goes and builds a big high-rise in the Mojave and says, hey, everybody come live here, it's really cheap, I'm going to make a bunch of money, and there's no Safeway or butcher shop or anything for folks to buy food, and folks will move out. So you can provide in-stream flows that meet space requirements that don't necessarily meet food requirements. In the canyon, throughout the Shasta River, food is driven, for juvenile salamanders, is driven by two different factors. One being benthic food production, that's invertebrates that grow on the rocks. The underwater invertebrate community has a huge effect on fish and their success. And the underwater invertebrate community is a cosmos. It's a world unto itself. There's wars and treaties and alliances going on the bed of the stream that you can't even see. I stop myself from going off too much on this because it's really fascinating. But those snot-covered bowling balls that you'll step on in a river, and slip on that periphyton growth on the outside of the rock. That's the foundation of the river food web. And there are bugs that have their mandible shaped like a snowplow, and they're real low profile body, and they'll move along that periphyton growth and harvest it. They'll scrape it off the rock. It's like the African safari, the gazelles and the zebras. And then there's marauding predator insects that'll come by and pillage their world. And the robustness of that benthic community is going to determine how much food is available for drift for juvenile salmonids to rear on. And you can relate the robustness of that benthic community to some specific hydraulic conditions in the riffles, right? Those benthic invertebrates really live in the riffles primarily because it has the right oxygen content. The water flowing of the riffle produces good oxygen, and also it has the right microhabitat where they can find their space to live. And there are pretty good literature guidelines about velocity over different sizes of sediment that will promote good benthic invertebrate production. Now, there are more different species of benthic invertebrates than we can count. And so we're focusing on those ones that are known to be real primary key salmonid food sources. So benthic invertebrates are really important, and we did a lot of work on that. I'm going to get to why this is what this relates to dry and wet years here. The other food source that's really important is food from the floodplain itself. There's a enormous amount of literature, and it's true in the Shasta as well, that when fish are able to get out of the channel and get up onto the floodplain, both you're bringing nutrient content into the river, into the river food web, and you're also accessing terrestrial insects and insects that are associated with the aquatic wetland type environment that maybe occurs on the edge of the channel. And you're also providing a whole lot more space for fish to rear. In a dry year, we're not going to expect that juveniles are going to be able to get out of the channel as often and take advantage of those floodplain rearing environments. We're going to focus on providing good conditions within the channel. In a wet year, the flow regime would be more inclined to provide that opportunity for them to get out and rear on the margins and the benches. And the unimpaired hydrograph kind of give us an idea about the duration of how long would that happen in different water year types. So we can kind of use that as a guideline to help us differentiate between wetter and drier years. So drier years, we're focusing on in-channel needs, meeting all the needs of our fish really within the space of the active channel. And on the wetter years, we're promoting more floodplain rearing and floodplain capacity. So I'm just going to go over what the objectives were for each life history phase that we were trying to meet, and then we'll talk about the flows again that met those, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about our level of confidence in different times of the year. So for the early Chinook migration period, our main goals were to promote those fish entering the river and to provide passage for them as they move up through the canyon, to minimize delay. Especially during this period, the canyon's pretty warm. We're here in early September, we're seeing water temperatures in excess of 70 degrees. And they can actually provide a barrier. You can have a thermal barrier to migration if it gets too hot. So we want to promote those type of conditions hydraulically and thermally that will allow them to move upstream. I've talked a little bit about what we're trying to do during the spawning period. We're trying to provide extensive spawning habitat throughout the canyon and diverse spawning habitat in different areas, especially in those big tailouts that Chinook really like. And we're also trying to maintain and encourage upstream migration. One of the triggers of upstream migration, one of the triggers is thought to be velocity. You can take a depth that's passable for fish, and you'll see this like in the Mad River in Arcata. We often see fish piled up in a pool where they can easily migrate upstream through the riffle, and yet they choose not to. But when you have that velocity core moving through the pool, boom, that's a trigger for them and they move upstream. The triggers that promote upstream migration are debated in the literature, and whether there's scent or whether there's other type of things moving into the channel. There's a lot of different theories about that, but velocity is highly listed on that. So these flows that are providing good spawning habitat in the tailouts are also providing good velocity cores down the center of the channel, and hopefully triggering our coho to migrate upstream and perhaps build less redds in the canyon. Here's a look at habitat rating curves for spawning. Like we were discussing making these habitat rating curves, and you'll notice, these are curves that are peaking at different times. The Hudson Road sites, and the Salmon Heaven site, there you see pretty good habitat available for spawning by 70 CFS. Yet those are the inside part of that curve where it peaks. That's your mid-channel habitat, right? So you have a lot of space in the mid-channel. Then as flows start to increase, the mid-channel may become too fast and no longer desirable, and you still have a lot of space because it's on the edges. And then as flows increase more, then you start to see a tail off in your reduction of available space. That little tiny curve at the bottom, that's the Salmon Heaven side channel site. It takes a lot of flow to produce enough stage to raise the water up high enough and get the hydraulic conditions adequate in the side channel to provide good habitat conditions. We don't expect that to happen every year, and we also don't expect it to happen for a long period of time, even in the wetter years. But getting back to Moyle's thinking about extensive habitat and not just relying on the peak of the curve at one location, that's going to promote life history success. It's going to promote many different life histories that'll make the population more resilient. In our so this is our winter rearing period. The goals for the winter rearing period are are in your wetter years to provide off-channel rearing habitat to get fish up onto the floodplains and allow them to rear, to stimulate food sources for those fish, and to both in the channel and off channel. We want to provide space for juveniles to rear and food sources. I mean, that's basically the end game for the winter period. That's also true for the spring period, but the spring period we have a couple more things going on. In the spring, we also have those fish that are smolting, and they're migrating out to the ocean. So not only do we want to provide space, a lot of space, to deal with all the juveniles that are coming from the upper watershed and moving out to the Klamath, and not only do we want to provide food, we also want to reduce the opportunity for those fish to strand. So you can have really good flow where fish are rearing on the floodplain. You can drop below that flow, and juveniles may get lost and stuck up on that flood. But then you come back above, so that washing machine type effect is a detrimental thing for fish during that period. As this April to June season progresses, and your daily average air temperatures start to increase, and your daily max air temperatures start to increase, water temperature will be sensitive to that. So we want to make sure that we're not providing flows that are so low that water temperatures are going to produce a thermally dangerous situation or make it more difficult for fish to grow during that part of the season. One of the ways we tried to get at one of the thresholds we really tried to get at was what was the incipient threshold for fish to get up out of the river and onto the floodplain. It's a really important thing to know. And there are a couple ways that we attempted to do it. One was just to take pictures, just to go out of those locations and say, at each flow, when are we providing a condition that meets juvenile rearing habitat? So the top left of these little 4 pictures here is 36 CFS. The top right is 95 CFS. The bottom left is 175, and the bottom right is 205. You'll notice there's no off-channel rearing at 36 CFS. There's essentially no off-channel rearing at 95. There's a little bit of a wetted habitat back here. But at that point, you're starting to have, while you don't have habitat for fish, you're starting to have some nutrient input and some, in the floodplain, and maybe is starting to contribute some food sources to fish in the channel. At 175, you've clearly got water back into the floodplain. Now, I don't know if that water is deep enough to provide habitat for your larger juveniles, but clearly there's habitat there. And at 205 CFS, you can clearly see that there's habitat for larger life stages of fish, for the smolt that are moving out. We also tried to model it. So we went in there and we surveyed the topography and built a 2-dimensional model. I'm not going to go through what all that is, but I will say that there are 1,350 points here that we shot when we were surveying it. And when after you shoot 1,350 points through one eye, you can't see through that eye anymore. I found that out. I didn't know that. So I was like blind in one eye when I was trying to eat a burrito at Casa Ramos after like a 14-hour day. That was a fun project. But we built a model. We modeled habitat on the floodplain. So this is the same floodplain here, taking a look at square feet. So instead of just a visual image of it, saying, okay, how much habitat is available for fish on the floodplain? So you can see in the grading curve, stream flow across the bottom and habitat on the floodplain across the top. Just as we saw in the photographs, at those lower flows, 50 to 60 to 70 CFS, you really weren't getting any water up onto the floodplain. Between about 75 CFS and 100, that's what we call the incipient inundation. You're just now starting to see some water move onto the floodplain. And between 100 and about 150, it slowly increases as that incipient inundation is moving across the floodplain. At 175 CFS, there's a sharp upswing in the amount of habitat available on the floodplain, especially for your larger fish. And they're able to rear and grow significantly if it flows above that. To me, it was, you may not be excited about this, but to me, that our observations from photographs correlated so well from a really complex 2-dimensional model that considers hydraulics and turbulence and everything that to drive stage. That was really exciting. That was really exciting when I saw that, wow, this does really seem to line up with what our direct observations were. So that was a useful result of this study. going to move through that slide. So that's the spring smolt out migration period. Moving on to the summer rearing period. Our goal in the summer was to enable juvenile fish that wanted to migrate upstream because thermal conditions may be too high. We wanted to provide juvenile habitat for them to migrate, and we wanted to provide for the fish that were going to rear in the canyon throughout the summer productive riffle habitat for BMI growth, and try to keep water temperatures below what we believe to be fatal for juvenile salmonids. Summer is important to talk about. I think the summer is a place where our lack of a water temperature model does impair us a little bit. There is some uncertainty, there's definitely uncertainty whether or not the conditions in the canyon, even under an unimpaired condition, would allow and promote good coho production in the canyon. We used water temperature thresholds developed from Stenhouse and other places specifically for the canyon that cited, detrimental conditions for coho juveniles, were above 20.3, and you were really, coho weren't super happy at 16, 17, and 18 degrees Celsius. I think as folks are working in the river more, we're finding out that in fact fish can rear under those conditions, especially when food production is abundant. And so we don't resolve in this study, I don't think we resolve whether or not the in-stream flows that we are recommending for habitat and food in the summer are going to provide thermal conditions to allow coho to oversummer. I think it's very likely that those conditions will allow steelhead to oversummer. They're a lot more tolerant of warm water temperatures, a lot more able to rear in warmer water temperatures. But we don't resolve whether or not they're going to allow coho to oversummer. We did measure this here, and this is why this picture, this is the salmon-headed side channel. We did observe when the side channel was wet, and the side channel was inundated at about 75 CFS is when flow starts to move through the gravel there. Almost up to a 10 degrees Celsius difference between water temperature in the main stem and water temperature in the side channel. So there's a pretty big disparity between those two places, and it's not, I'm not sure that difference is consistent throughout the entire decorative cycle, but that difference does exist. You have water moving through the gravels, it's colder, it's hyporheic flow is the term we use for that, and you have real good riparian cover that's preventing solar radiation from hitting the side channel. So the side channels may provide refugia, thermal refugia for juveniles that are rearing in the canyon through the summer. If I was a juvenile fish in the Shasta Basin, I would probably rather oversummer at Big Springs. Given that option and given what I know, but I don't think juvenile fish necessarily think the way I think. And so I think that discussion needs to continue. And one of the ways to address that question, there's two ways I think that question about thermal conditions in the summer can be addressed. One way is to build a water temperature model that takes a whole bunch of inputs from the upper basin and estimates what flow would be in the summer. Water temperature models are valuable tools. They allow you to game with, if we have this much water coming out of Big Springs and this much water coming out of Shasta and this much water coming from other sources, and we can play with those numbers to see what does happen. There's a lot of value in that. Another way is through an adaptive management approach. If we say, okay, here's the flow regime, and folks allow a certain amount of water to come down for one day, and we can measure and say, what did we see? Did we see conditions that seem to be able to promote fish in that? And I feel like that there's some ramifications to that discussion, because it's going to play a role in what I imagine would be recommended for summertime management.
So you guys wanted to do water temperature modeling but weren't able to?
Yeah.
Why is that?
That's a long story. We had, and some of that story is started before I was working at the company, so I want to be careful that I don't I don't have all the pieces to it. There was some funding originally dedicated to that task, and that funding went away, and I don't know why, but by the time we picked this up again and we were making our in-stream flow recommendations, there was no money for doing a water temperature model. Depending on the complexity of the model, it could, depending on how big in the basin that model is built to, it could be a pretty expensive endeavor. And when you do a water temperature model, you also have to consider other sources that affect the thermal regime of the river, groundwater sources, et cetera. So you need to have a good handle on if you're looking for 1 to 2 to 3 degrees C accuracy on those type of things. And so I definitely am not detracting from the value of the water temperature model. I think it would be, I think it could play a really good role in helping us to fine tune what we should recommend in the summertime.
But you have some data on that now, right?
We have water temperature data
Yeah.
on the existing conditions,
Yeah.
but we don't have an understanding of what would happen in a different management scenario. So for example, if we recommend 75 CFS in the summer to meet physical habitat, and we get 50 CFS from Big Springs and 20, where that water comes from will affect how warm it is when it gets to the canyon. In addition, it's warming as it moves downstream. There was a model done by Null et al. In 2010, and they modeled an unimpaired condition with water coming out of Big Springs Creek, and they still found in the main stem part of the canyon, they estimated, based on their model, that water temperatures would be exceeding 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So the value of the model is to be able to game with boundary conditions, to be able to estimate what would happen. But I think it's still uncertain whether or not we'd be able to meet those water temperature conditions. So the way we evaluated water temperature in the context of this study was we took all the data we had from a specific period. So in the July 1st to September 14th period, for example, there's that summer base flow period, we said, okay, let's plot all the data we have for water temperature, and let's see what the stream flow was on a certain day. It seemed to us that for these 5 years of record, 4 years of record that we had, that when you exceeded 70 CFS, which just so happened to meet some physical habitat requirements for juveniles in the canyon, you were a lot less likely to exceed your lethal thresholds. Of course, every single point there, this point may be, there was a whole bunch of irrigation return flow on that day, and so the sources of this water are not defined in the study, and that's one of the weaknesses of a regression assessment. The value is you can see general trends. So a water temperature model would allow us to identify what the sources of that water is and the boundary condition for those sources, how hot or cold were they at their release temperature. And it would help us to refine that. The other way to refine it, as I said, is just to try it and see with an adaptive management approach. So we started with this and kind of wrap up with this. These are the flow needs that we felt like, based on our habitat assessment and based on the qualitative approach described by Moyle, would meet population, would support a sustained population of fish over the long term in different water year types. This is not an interim flow study, this is not a minimum flow study. Fish can get by on less water than this, but can you sustain a population over the long term? We feel like this is what it would take